have you been?
Good, how about you? Busy, I take it.
Busy, yeah. I think our GA is pretty much over.
What, everything's been killed?
Funny how things work.
2 weeks ago, I would have said just wait till 2020, not a problem.
Yeah, I know. And then unprecedented.
Check my yearbooks.
Yeah.
Mic check. 1, 2. Hello. Hi. How's everybody doing? All right. So my name is Deron Chavis, and today is a really amazing day. It feels great outside. I want to just thank everyone for deciding to spend a little bit of time indoors with us today for a provocation, right, of sorts. We're here at the Institute for Contemporary Art to have a conversation about race, place, and gentrification in Richmond, Virginia. We entitled this forum, Richmond versus Everybody. I'm gonna start this conversation, or at least do a little bit of an intro and give you the inspiration around which this forum was birthed. So, a little bit about myself. I'm a native Richmonder. I was born in Richmond, Virginia. I was born on South Side. And it wouldn't be until I reached my 30s, probably about 36, that I first had the opportunity to go to Everbody Church. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with Everbody. Everbody is one of the oldest religious institutions in the city of Richmond. So this particular day, I was taking a tour, garden tour, right? I have a bunch of folks that I work with. I work for Genrification Botanical Garden. So I had this amazing opportunity to walk with some folks through gardens around the city. And so one of the stops was Everbody, right? And the tour guide explained as we, approached the building, the church building, that this is one of the oldest churches in the city, right? And she expressed that from the doorway of the church in the 1600s, early 1700s, that this building was bequeathed, or that land was bequeathed to, these early, colonizers of Richmond, Virginia, by the King George of England, right? And that from the doorway of this church on Melbourne and Patterson, that one could at one time see to the James River, and that all of that land had been bequeathed to the folks that, own the church, right? So that was something like 50,000 acres that was bequeathed to the colonizers of, this area. So it struck me that when we talk about land use, and we talk about dispossession, and we talk about displacement, we often contextualize that conversation in a contemporary way. We act as if, these phenomena that we experience where folks are pushed out and some have more rights or some have more favor than others is relatively new. However, the narrative of Virginia is one where some were given a privilege over land and its use, while others were marginalized from its use. So, it was intriguing for me, kind of like a light bulb moment, like, oh man, we're thinking about this thing all wrong. That this phenomenon of folks being displaced from neighborhoods, from places, is not new to Richmond. It's not new to Southside. It's not new to Church Hill. It's not new to Northside. You know, it's ingrained in the very fabric of this country, right? So earlier I said I was born in Richmond, raised in Richmond. So I have a very vivid memory in watching the transformation of our city, right? I recall watching the removal or destruction of Blackwell, right? Blackwell housing projects was removed in the late, 90s, early 2000s. And so I had friends, family even, that lived in Blackwell, right? And so what we see today in terms of an area, with the dialogue about whether this is Manchester, whether this is Blackwell, whether this is Swansboro, when I was growing up, it was Blackwell, right? And nobody wanted to live there because the housing projects and crime and all of these ideas that are rooted in the conversation around benign neglect were a reality, right? And I think it's important for us to inspect like what the precedents were, what created these realities, and not only what created these realities, but what are some things that can be done or are being done to mitigate, remove, or even eliminate the dispossession of indigenous people in their communities in the city of Richmond. So today I have assembled a motley crew of advocates, community representatives, housing experts to really, let's dig into this. I'll use the word dialogue today in the truest sense that this is not, an academic exercise per se. This is a community conversation. I've decided that, we didn't want to have this to be super formal where, we're the people up front with all the answers and the folks in the attendance are the ones that are here to get some information. No, there's a collective wisdom in the room. And as we move along in the dialogue, I encourage conversation, question. That's why we got wireless mics so that we can have some discourse about this conversation. So, I'm going to introduce the people on my panel today, and then we're going to jump into it. I got a couple questions that I've jotted down that they've been notified about, right? There's no surprises, right? We're going to keep this as casual as possible. I wanted to have wine in the gallery, but they said that was against the rules, so I apologize. I promise y'all drinks. Couldn't do it. It's probably for the best. We need bourbon for the conversation. We need some hard liquor for this conversation. To my left and to your right, I have Ryan Koziol, who is with Home. And where's the other mic? Brian, I'm gonna let you introduce yourself.
You already did.
Well, I just tell a little bit. I'm gonna pose a question for you and each person that's on the panel. You can answer that as your introduction, right? Okay. So you live in Richmond, presumably, right? Yep. So what is one of your fondest memories about living in the city of Richmond?
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Kozo. I work with Housing Opportunities Made Equal here in Richmond. I've been in Richmond for about 15 years. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. Richmond has given me a lot of good memories. I was married here in a house in Battery Park. Both of my children were born while we lived there. Made a lot of really close friends. Hopefully have done a lot of important work. So yeah, maybe, what can top having children, getting married. Those are my fondest memories.
All right, pass the mic. I got to his right, or in my left, we got Jonathan Knopke of the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. And no, before you, I give a round of applause for Brian for showing up today. Next up, I have Jonathan Knopke, who I met not in this context, in another world life of work around urban greening at Lewis Ginter, but he serves as a staff person or a staff member of the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. I'm curious. Same question. What's your fondest memory of living in Richmond?
Well, I'm not married and I have no kids, so it's a tougher question for me, I think, but I am also a Richmond area native. I lived in the city for, I guess, about 7 or 8 years now. I'm a VCU grad, twice over undergrad and grad, so I think my favorite memories in the city so far are being made now, which might be a cop-out, but I really think this is a great time to be in Richmond. The energy around these conversations and approaching issues of equity and really trying to make Richmond work for folks who it hasn't worked for decades is really exciting. And I think being in this room and this energy will quickly become one of my favorite memories in the city.
Nice. Yeah, give it up for Jonathan.
Good afternoon. My name is Art Burton. I'm the Executive Director of Kinfolk Community and the Operations Director for an organization called Community Unity in Action, which is a leadership social justice roundtable where we work on pretty much all the social justice issues in the city. I came to Richmond in 1970. My mother and father moved us to the Caroline, which was the first community in the city of Richmond that was being very intentional about black and white folks living together. Most people find that surprising because I spent a lot of time in public housing. My father came here as the Associate Director of the Richmond Urban League, and his portfolio was housing and economic development, and he spent a great deal of time organizing in public housing communities. I wanted to make one correction. I am not a community advocate or a community representative. I am a political activist. That is my work. And my work is in the defense of black communities and black people. That is what I spend the majority of my time doing. And so it's a pleasure to be here with you guys today.
Nice. Yeah, give it up for Art Burton. Next, I've had the pleasure of spending the last 6 to 8 months with this brother. Over the last 6 to 8 months, we've been co-joined at the hip as fellows for the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation and their Health and Equity Fellowship. So it's been a really amazing opportunity to learn a lot more about the work that you're doing. Willie Hilliard, right? Yes, the man. So I wanted to give the people a little bit of a rundown. He's with the Brooklyn Park Area Association, right? So for those that might not know who you are, give them a little bit of a background about what you do and what's one of your favorite memories about living in Richmond.
Thank you. My name is Willie Hilliard. Y'all know me, because this is hard for me. I don't like to talk about myself. I'm a native Richmonder, native Northsider. Right now, I am the executive director of the historic Brooklyn Park Collective, formerly known as the Brooklyn Park Area Association, which I am a business owner on Brooklyn Park Boulevard. I guess the fondest memories of Richmond, for me, I'm still formulating. Growing up in Richmond in the 60s and 70s, I would tell you like this, as an 18-year-old, I hated Richmond. Richmond didn't have the opportunities for a black person in this city. My mother was a Black Panther. I remember the Black Panther Party, and she was ran out of Richmond in the early 60s. I would say that the Richmond that I see today, I love Richmond. I just wish she was here to see it. She's no longer with us. That she can see the changes that Richmond has made, and there's been a lot of positive changes, but there is so much more that needs to be done in the city. And I think with the right-minded collection of people like Ron and the panel and yourselves, we can really make this city what we want it to be. And I love Richmond.
Give it up for Willie Hill. And certainly not least, but the last introduction is another amazing soul spirit, Shekinah Mitchell of Virginia Lisk, who I also had the pleasure and honor of sharing space with for the last 6 to 8 months with the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation as a Health and Equity Fellow. Give the people a little bit of the background of yourself and what's one of your fondest memories as a Richmonder.
Hi, everybody. I also just want to give a shout out to Lisette. She's the other Health and Equity Fellow who is here. It's like a big reunion.
Yes.
And if you are looking for a consultant around issues around diversity and inclusion, holla at Lisette. So, it's tough to pick just one memory. So I am from the East End. I'm from Churchill. I guess one of my favorite moments is that my parents bought their first home, and they have crazy stories. Both grew up in public housing. My dad ended up in foster care. So it was a really, really big deal when they were able to have their first home. It's on Mosby Street, and they moved there when I was around 8 years old. And my dad was so excited, he literally slept on the front porch the night before they got the keys. It was a big deal because it meant that all of his brothers and sisters had a place to go for Christmas and Thanksgiving. Like the small things that we take advantage of, this house like represented all of that for his whole family. So that was a fun memory, getting my own room for the first time. But another one has nothing to do with housing. It's kind of a hood story. So I have my favorite corner store, and I used to go there all the time. Cheech was the guy who owned it. He knew exactly how to make my cheeseburger. And I was walking out one day, and there was this fine man, and he was like, "How you doing, young lady?" And I was like, I'm fine. What's your name? We talked and talked and talked. And he asked me for my phone number. And at the time, he thought I was lying, but I actually had lost my phone. But I was like, I'll give you my number, and if you can reach me, then I guess it's meant to be, but if not, then oh well. And we'll be celebrating our 10-year wedding anniversary.
That's magnificent. Thank you for sharing. I'll give it up for Shekinah. Thank y'all. So, I'll start this off by telling a story. So, I grew up in Southside. I was raised off Hopkins Road, right? Which I just found out maybe like a year ago was called Dearborn. I had no clue that was the name of the neighborhood. Go figure. But I now live in Northside. So I live in a house that is third generation. My fiance, her grandparents bought the house in the 1950s. They moved into Northside from Church Hill. For those who are not familiar, people of color have been migratory around the city of Richmond, since its inception, right? We hear stories about Jackson Ward, we hear stories about Barton Heights, we hear stories about East Richmond and Church Hill, but the narratives of people of color in the city, correspond with some of our, the same stories about desegregation and white flight and massive resistance. Like people moved around the city as a result. You know, we talk about redlining and things like that. We can get into that a little later. But this story struck me because, you know, what happened is that Northside is experiencing an acceleration of, or an increase in property value, right? So after my fiance's grandparents passed away, they left the house to my fiance's mother, who, you know, lived on a fixed income. You know, she's on disability, right? And so as the property values increased, we live in a house that's oil-based heat, right? So, you know, it becomes a question as, do I pay my taxes or do I live in a cold house in the winter time, right? So it kind of quickly got out of control. So me and my fiance said, okay, what we're gonna do is we're gonna come in and we're gonna take over the mortgage, right, of the house. And so I met my aunt-in-law, and she recounted this story about how when she was young in her preteens in the 1950s, latter part of the 1950s, that this family, the Marshes, were one of the first families to move into Northside, right? And she said something that just blew my mind was that, you know, someone had burned a cross in their front yard on the corner of North Avenue and Meredith, right? We probably pass up and down that street every day. But in the 1950s, someone was burning a cross on her front yard as being one of the first African-American families to move into Northside, right? And so I say this to contextualize, you know, this week, I know a lot of us are exhausted by, you know, what's going on with the government in terms of Northam and, you know, Herring and all this different type of stuff. But, you know, our grandparents lived under threat of Klan activity, right? So that's my mother's generation, my grandparents, right? So it's not too far along ago where someone was afraid of their safety as a result of a Klan hood. And in the context of blackface, I think it's important for us to be aware of where this stuff comes from, that this is about racial tyranny. And in that moment, you know, someone was trying to scare this family from living in a particular neighborhood, right? Fast forward 30 years later, 40, 50 years later, now this area is the hot spot, you know, and the folks that have lived there for the last 20 years, 20, 30 years are now being pushed out. So I just want to center the conversation in that context, right? That when we talk about race and place, you know, we're not talking we're not decontextualizing, you know, these realities. We're not ahistorical in our analysis of what's going on, and that we're very clear that, you know, contemporary realities are colored by what came before, the predecessors, all right? So I gave y'all a couple questions. So this is gonna be easy, just to kind of break the ice. We have some diversity in this panel, right, or this conversation. I want to hear from y'all, what, from your vantage point, does gentrification look like from your vantage point, from your point of view as a resident of Richmond, as a person who works, you know, particularly in the realm of housing, who works, whether it be nonprofit or community, who works in the community, who lives in this society. What does gentrification look like to you in Richmond?
Thank you. You know, when I got the invitation to do this event, I started not to come here because I said I wasn't going to have a conversation about gentrification, no affordable housing, and I have intentionally stayed out those conversations because I just I get a little disconcerted when we It seems like all the conversations that we have in a way to keep white folks comfortable. And we have a couple people who are allowed to have those conversations, and we tend not to talk about the elephant that's in the room, and that's the elephant of race. You know, it amazes me now when because now all of the black communities, everyone who lives in it has trauma, okay? And the trauma that we have, they need trauma-informed care because they have trauma. But no one ever talks about the fact that the trauma has been caused by racism. And we just left that out. And so I wanted to be careful when I came here today, I want to correct one thing. In 1929, 92% of the black people in the city of Richmond lived in Jacksonville. Okay? And white people decided, white power structure decided that they were unsightly. It didn't look good for the city to have that many black people in its central core, and they needed to be moved. And over the next 40 years, they set about destroying those communities and moving black people all around the city. We want to have conversations about eviction, gentrification, affordable housing. There is no such thing in this city as affordable housing for poor black people, okay? Anybody who wants to tell you about affordable housing, you should tell them that's not a conversation in the context of poor black people or working class black people. There's just simply no such thing. And we really need to, and I'm gonna stop here by saying if we're gonna have the conversations, we really need to have real conversations because everybody in this city knows what was done to create the racist system that we live in. And either we're going to undo what we did or we're going to live with it. But we shouldn't continue to walk around and not act like we don't know what was done.
Thank you.
I think to me, gentrification in Richmond just looks like the history of this nation repeating itself at the local level. Right, so I look at a lot of data and make maps and stuff and talk about them. And if we look at the last 15 years, right, the economic crisis, foreclosure epidemic in 07 and 08, right, we know that was caused, right, that was created it was a part of white wealth creation, right? They knew that we could spin these loans off and people could make a lot of money. And we know that black and brown neighborhoods were targeted for these loans, right? So if you take that, where subprime loans were made, and then the resulting foreclosures, and then you look at current mortgage lending data and put it all together, that's exactly what gentrification looks like in the city. And this was years ago. I was at an event sort of like this, and somebody was talking about, so it's 2007, 2008, 2009, when African American neighborhoods accounted for well over half of all of the foreclosures in the region. I heard it referred to as a modern day land grab. And it was, right? And whether it was like orchestrated behind closed doors with, these mythical, powers of, of the business community, I don't know. But the result is the same, right? It took wealth and land from brown and black families. And so that's what we have to stop doing.
But you got it. During the Obama administration, 50% of the wealth of black communities was taken back from it, okay, through these subprime loans. It absolutely was intentional. And even today, after he bailed out the banks and gave them all of that money, if you look today, most black people are still locked out of being able to borrow money to own a home, okay? The credit score of 700 means that most black people in this city simply don't qualify. So effectively, not only was all of, there is no white president who could have done what Barack Obama did, which was steal all the black people's money and give it away to white folks, and then take their homes and then lock them out of the market and keep us locked out of the market while the city is literally being taken over by affluent middle-class people. And that, I just want to make sure we're clear about that this was intentional, and the results are still affecting black people's ability to not only own homes, but create a self-sustaining economy for themselves.
Everybody that has spoken so far has been much more eloquent than I can be about all those points. So I just want to mention that I've had the privilege of teaching an Intro to Urban Planning class, an undergraduate class here at VCU, and one of the topics that comes up over and over again is gentrification. And I see some of these students really, I think, struggle, but in a good way, with talking about what it is and what it means and how to process it. And I'm by no means the best person to help explain that to them. But one thing that I have found helpful is to think of it, as she kind of mentioned, as a true process. I am like Brian, I'm a data guy. I like to analyze things and analyze maps. And so when something is a process, there is a precondition, then there is action, and then there is a post condition, right? There's, pre something happening and then post. And so, I've had students say, well, Carytown is gentrified, right? And I'm like, no, not quite. We have to think about what were the existing conditions that have to be there before, gentrification can take place. And I think that's a really interesting conversation. And then there's the process itself, right? Which I think wealth extraction and manipulation is a huge part of it as well. So I think that's a big part of the process. And then an almost entirely different conversation is what is the end result of that, and what is that post condition that happens in these neighborhoods, and is that post period of time, how stable is that? Does the neighborhood cycle again? I think we've seen, as Duran has alluded to, changes in neighborhoods, especially in Richmond, dating back hundreds of years, have happened over and over again. Because of racism, because of intentional efforts to move people out for nefarious reasons. And so I think it's really important to frame gentrification, at least for me, to help understand it as a true, iterative process that is driven, by racism, by the desire to extract wealth from certain areas. But there's tons of just huge macro level things that go into it, and micro level conditions that are the result of it. So that's the way I think of it, and so this conversation is, I think, beginning to really help me as well understand that process aspect of it.
I don't like the word gentrification. I don't like the term affordable housing as well. We'll get into that later. For me, gentrification is intentional, cyclical racism. And I say it's cyclical for this reason. As I stated before, my mother was ran out of the city. I went to live with my grandmother in 1968. In a neighborhood known as Providence Park in Northside, which is walking distance from the Richmond Raceway. When I moved over there, our community probably was 40% white. And it wasn't a good thing. I mean, they were our neighbors. Probably a few years later, in the early 70s, everybody moved out. The white flight took, and they left. They left our cities and our communities in a bad shape. And a lot of people were able to move into these homes, but they couldn't sustain them because there still were no real job opportunities for blacks in the city. No real assistance was given. And then the drug epidemic came. And that really destroyed our communities, leaving most of these homes to be shells because the people that lived in them couldn't sustain them. So now we see here in the last, and I'm just speaking on North Side, probably in the last 7 to 8 years, the white community has come back. And the reason is because these are the cheapest homes in the city that they can buy. And they come in with their ideas of community, and they're not the same ideas of community that the residents that are already there have. So there's this clash of culture because the new residents see community and see life and living in a different way than those who've been there 30, 40 years. So there's a strong clash in the community for control of the culture. Probably, I guess 10, 15 years ago when Hurricane Gaston came through the city and it destroyed Battery Park. For anybody that knows Battery Park, it destroyed Battery Park. That was the first influx of white flight back into the city. And from my personal recollection, those first families that came into the community were not welcoming. They wanted things their way, you know, and they thought that we should conform to what they wanted. And the black people in our community said, no, because we've been here forever, you're not gonna tell us what we're gonna do, because we're not going anywhere. I will say that the recent flight of the last 5 years has gotten better. The millennials, I would say, are a lot more open to being, you know, better neighbors and better community and trying to figure out how we can all sustain and get along together. But it's a lot of work, and a lot of these developers are coming in now and they only see the dollars. So a lot of our residents who I deal with, I mean, there's not a day that goes by that at least 30 to 40 black families within Northside are getting phone calls about selling their homes. You know, it's getting to the point now that they have got going past buying vacant homes, and I'm just gonna buy you out your home, you know, with no care as to where you're going. So gentrification for me is a fight that I'm in, and I'm fully prepared for it. And we're just gonna make it work. You know, it sounds bad, and it is, but you know, out of every darkness comes some light, and we're gonna find a light within this.
So, we're in the process of naming the problem, right? You know, so I'm gonna do a little historical context because it's been alluded to, but I don't think anybody has pointed out to it directly. So, Dr. John Meeser from University of Richmond has done an exquisite amount of research on redlining in the city of Richmond. And the way the story goes is that in the 1950s, you know, the Federal Housing Administration went about the business of going throughout the country to try to create wealth through financing of home ownership in communities across the country. So there was an organization developed called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that went in and assessed the values of neighborhoods across the country. Richmond was no exception. And the way these assessments went is that they graded neighborhoods based on the quality of, you know, the homes or the demographics. And in Richmond, you know, the term redlining comes from these assessors literally taking red marker and painting entire neighborhoods in red, right? And those neighborhoods being African American or black or brown communities with no other criterion other than they were places where people of color lived, right? So you would take an example of a neighborhood like Jackson Ward, which was predominantly black at the time. The quality of that neighborhood is amazing, right? These are historic homes. Some of the most unique ironwork in the country exists in the homes along Clay Street, right? These are amazingly built spaces. But, you know, the assessors said that because there were African Americans that lived in this neighborhood, that they would get a failing grade right? And as a result, were ineligible for mortgages and financing from the federal government, right? To the exception of all of their white counterparts that were able to acquire these financing. So for an entire government program to basically discriminate against African American communities in such a way created an intense disparity in one of the most clear methods of wealth building in this country, which is home ownership, right? So if we say that, and this, for us to say that this happened in tandem with what Art spoke about in the relationship of the creation of Highway 95, which decimated or bisected Jackson Ward, removing thousands of homeowners from that area in order to create the highway, to, you know, the antithesis of the Richmond community that did not want the highway to go through the city, right? And then we had the third layer of divestment by families of white ancestry, European ancestry, who decided that because of the desegregation of public schools, that folks did not want to live in close proximity and that they would participate in white flight and mass persistence. So this is the historical context that we find ourselves when we fast forward 60 years later and we identify those same neighborhoods that were redlined. These are the areas that are, you know, what are termed neighborhoods in transition, right? And these are the same neighborhoods that Black and brown communities are being pushed out from, right? So I just want to put that inside of the room because I think it's important for people to, you know, acknowledge or at least be in a clear understanding of, you know, what we're seeing today didn't just happen, right? And that there were specific policies that were put in place, there were specific efforts that came about that crippled neighborhoods, that created a reality where people couldn't afford, right, to rehab homes, purchase homes. You know, there was a wealth disparity that was created by these realities, right? You want to share?
And I want to be careful not to relegate this to a historical moment or a moment done by just the government, because when I decided to come here, I didn't want to just come here and say it's just racism, y'all. And so I decided I would look up the definition of gentrification. And under number 2, it said it is an intentional violent act created and perpetrated by powerful corporate interests, okay? And that's what gentrification is. It is a violent act, or as my sister would say, it is economic violence, okay? And that's what's going on. So I've lived in Richmond 50 years, even though I'm only 42. And I've lived in every community, Jackson Ward. I've always followed gentrification follows me, okay? Because my work as an activist means I work in communities that have been intentionally isolated, intentionally marginalized, intentionally left without police folks. And so when they get so violent and so out of control, then people say, well, we better give him a job. And they call me in and to try to help change these communities. And so I'm always one step ahead of gentrification in Jackson Ward, Highland Park, and now Churchill. I went to Jackson Ward in 1980, and this is something you guys can do to help stop gentrification, or at least be aware of it, because the corporate and the development class of the city of Richmond have always used the creative and artistic class of VCU and its students as the precursors of gentrification. So they always move young, white, creative, and artistic people into Black communities first because they figure you guys can live with us, okay? That y'all are so creative and crazy, y'all will figure out a way to live with us, okay? All right? And then after they leave you there about 5 or 6 or 7 years, they come in and they buy up everything, and then they move you guys to the next community where they can do it all over again. And that's been the history of this city, in Jackson Ward, Highland Park, and now in Church Hill. And the restaurant that is now the Gar Bar was put in 1980 by a professor here, art professor, Kim Weinberner, Dick Blosser, a realtor, Cortland Spots, Billy LeBrow, with the intention of creating a hub for white people to act off of and move inside of Jackson Ward. That was what it was put there for. And I know because I was the first manager of that restaurant. And that was their intention. And so the community decided they would just rob them 3 times and get them out, okay? Which they did, and we partied there for 20 years until Gar Bar came. But they planted the seed for gentrification of Jackson Ward, and that was the intent. And that is always the intent of these corporate class. We see it in Blackwell now with the Hills. You know, everybody knew gentrification was occurring, but nobody believed it was occurring on the scale that it was occurring, where one family was buying up 76 buildings backed by $250 million. It was like, God damn. This is different. This used to be like little sets of white people, you know, running in at the same time, knock a few of them off, but this is different, you know? And so I just want to be clear about that what was done historically is now being done intentionally, and it's happening on an unprecedented scale in this city at a time when black people cannot possibly amass enough money to push back against it. Well, we just, you know, $250 million, there is nowhere we can go and get that kind of money, okay? So I just want to be clear, but you guys can recognize what is occurring as you move into these communities. And if you understand how you're being used to aid and abet that, then maybe we can start having some different conversations about how we build and transform communities organically.
So I'm gonna throw the second question out because we spent a few minutes on this. I want to get to at least 3 of the 4 questions that I posed.
I don't get to do this much, though, so.
Hey, look, Art, I'm so glad you're here. Look, seriously. So, Brian, you know, you're my resident numbers guy, right? So I'm going to ask you this question, and anyone can chime in, but I know you know or you're familiar with it because I've been in the room with you for a couple of these presentations. Where are we seeing the trends in terms of displacement in the city of Richmond? What has been, or what are some of the most alarming trends in terms of neighborhood transition demographically that you can, you know, speak to in the few moments that we have today?
Sure. So, looking at just like demographic data, population data, right? You can look at changes over time relatively easily. Did a thing in conjunction with the Valentine a couple years back in which I actually did that, right, at a pretty detailed level. Manchester, and like we got into this whole thing about the names of neighborhoods, and the city has definitions of neighborhoods that differ from what residents think of as their neighborhoods. So I don't want to go down that path, but generally, like Manchester, that like warehouse industrial area that got completely redeveloped, in 2000, the U.S. Census Bureau found 1 person living there, right? If y'all know who that was, I'd love to talk to them.
They probably got displaced.
They're probably long gone. And then 10 years later, right, and that development really started in like 06, 07, right? 700 and some odd folks, right? Church Hill has been, you know, you can see if you map year over year over year, you can see, and let's just say on your map, you know, blue dots are white people, you see like this blue cluster expand. Blackwell, Oak Grove, those areas, definitely along Semmes Avenue. And then like the Brooklyn Park neighborhood recently. And that's been, I think, probably the most intense. You know, that's been since really, I don't know, it was like 08, 09, right when, yeah, you know, I mean, there were some a little bit before, but it really took off like starting 2010, I think, and we're 9 years out, and that neighborhood is completely, a completely different neighborhood than, you know, even when I lived there in, you know, 2005. So those are kind of the three areas. I think Scott's Addition is kind of unique because it was this, it's, you know, and that's not really displacement that I know of. It's a whole different thing, right?
It's like the conversion of warehouses into loft apartments.
Right.
It's a
Right.
different type of. Well, some folks will speak to what effects it's having on Carver. You know, I mean, at you know, closer
Right.
to the city, and that there were people there, but you know, it was kind of like on the margins, but they're getting pushed out as well.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? I just wanted to make sure to put that in.
I feel like I'm pulling my receipts. So I'm not like a data expert, but because I'm from Churchill, I was just like, what is happening in my neighborhood, and could talk about it qualitatively, could say, okay, Churchill is considered a food desert, but there are restaurants here now with like $50 a plate. How is that happening in the same space? But wanted to have some data and information, but specifically around the race piece. I looked at some census data, and I'll just read this brief paragraph. It says, in my neighborhood, this racialized wave of gentrification is moving from south to north. So again, this is Churchill. According to census data comparing 2010 and 2016, and let me pause. So I'm going to use terms like East End South and East End North. I use 9 Mile Road as a barrier. So essentially the census tracts that are south of 9 Mile Road versus the ones that are north of 9 Mile Road. Y'all with me? Thumbs up? Cool. East and South saw the number of white people increase by 44%, which is 2.5 times the rate of growth in the black population. In addition, while blacks comprise the largest racial ethnic group in East and South in 2010, by 2016, whites were in the majority. While East and South saw a significant shift in racial demographics, East and North saw no changes in racial demographics greater than 2%. So again, if you think about how this is happening, I mean, even using the word wave, it's like block by block moving forward. There's a whole section of the neighborhood that still looks like Churchill from the 90s, but then there's this whole other section that is rapidly changing, and it's definitely racialized.
Yeah, so the wave is definitely a thing. So if you map home transactions or home sales in Churchill annually over time, going back 5-6 years or so. So start right after the recession when activity really started picking up. You could, if you kind of interpolate the area of the blocks of homes that are going for over $200,000, you know, 10 years ago that was really just in the core, you know, historic designated area of Churchill around St. John's Church. And slowly but surely, about every year, that blob of homes that are going for well over $200,000 is moving up by at least 1 block a year. And recently, it's been jumping 2 to 3 blocks, and now it's all the way up by, you know, M Street or so, and continuing to march forward. And if we look at the census data, I don't have the exact figures, but the net loss of black homeowners in Churchill, even since 2010, is in the hundreds. And so it's the scale at which this is happening there is really remarkable. But yeah, I think it's interesting to look at Church Hill and then also think about Manchester and Scott's Addition. And I want to make sure, one thing that I really want to make clear for people in the audience who are still kind of teasing gentrification and this idea, and trying to figure out how to talk about it. You know, what we're talking about here today is very, very different than what's happening, you know, in Manchester and Scott's Addition, because again, you have to look at the preconditions, who was there beforehand, and what are the policy mechanisms and policy choices that are leading to these rapid shifts in neighborhoods. And I think it's almost disingenuous to say that Scott's Addition is gentrifying or Manchester, the core Manchester industrial area is gentrifying. I think we need some very different words to describe what's happening in these two different types of neighborhoods.
Yeah, I will agree it's a little different in Scott's Addition because it was a warehouse space. But you also have to understand this as a political attack as well. When my father and the men and women in the early 70s helped create this government, because this is a new government, it was based on the idea that black people would be represented politically by controlling certain districts, that by being represented in certain districts where they had majority control, and that majority control was based on where black people lived. And at the time, the corporate community, even in the 70s, you know, they fought from 70 to 77 before they were finally forced to relinquish the political control of this city. And even then, the commitment was that they did not want black people to run the city of Richmond. And, you know, and really didn't think we were capable of running the city of Richmond. And so when you look at what's going on with the housing in certain Manchester, you know, and when I ran for public office in 1997 in Highland Park, Saad El-Amin said to me, you know, the 6th district is the only district in the city of Richmond where a black person can speak unapologetically for black people and not have to worry about political repercussion. Because no white people lived in the 6th district. But Manchester is, all of those white folks who had moved in the 6th district, now when you look, the last election, Councilwoman Ellen Robinson had a 29-year-old white guy run against her, and she only won, I think it was 600 votes. Wow. Yeah. Yes, that's the change system, unprecedented. You may not even have black representation by the next election, okay? That's why the conversation about Parker Agilesto is so critical to this city, because essentially he is taking us back to when we were represented by white men all from the 1st district. That's where we are. I mean, it is really scary for those of us who have given our lives to this idea that there would be this black political leadership and this black economic agenda to be looking at today, where we may be faced with no black political representation and literally no money and are being forced out of the city completely is kind of scary.
All right, thank you for sharing that. That's a great context. So listen, we've named the problem. I think we did the MRI, X-ray, CAT scan. We got a good understanding of what the problem is. So now let's talk about, what we can do to excise this thing, right? What's the recommendation for surgery? Like, what's the prognosis? I brought each one of you all up here today because from my vantage point, I consider you all not to just be the folks that stew in the problem. I consider y'all to be solutionaries as well, right? Can we, I think, there's a consensus. Yeah, if I get a tag, I'm gonna market that. So what are some efforts in place or strategies that you can identify that you feel can help mitigate, slow down, or cease the dispossession and displacement of communities of color in the city of Richmond? That's a big question. And you just, you spark.
So I'm working on 3 projects right now. So we're pushing back, because we started pushing back. On Brooklyn Park Boulevard, I'm partnered with Lamar Dixon on the bank building, and we just recently signed a MOU with Virginia Union University to put a small business development center there, which we intend to use to bring interns through to support the existing black businesses on Brooklyn Park Boulevard to ensure that they have space and actually create more black entrepreneurs in the city and more black developers in the city. So I'm really excited about, and for the first time in 20 years, Virginia Union may even have a short-term presence on Broad Street, but it will eventually be the small business center will be eventually housed on Brooklyn Park Boulevard. In the East End, I'm working on the Food Justice Corridor, and that's in the entire part of the East End. And I defend public housing. We talk about eviction and affordable housing, but the housing of last resort is under attack in this city. And I met with the prospective CEO of the house, the new one that's coming in, and there is still a commitment to destroy public housing in this city. And I think we really need to address that. But we're pushing against that. We're going to fight for the opportunity to transform public housing. And so those are the two, I think the two. And then the last thing is we need workforce housing. There are models of homes that we could build for around $100,000 to $120,000. We did a project where Ryan ran a storefront for the Mosley Court community, where Bert Pinnick, who is one of the leading black architects in the city, has a model of home. We brought the mob kids over to help us reimagine Mosley Court. We call it Howard Grove. And what we found is as they started working on the project, they figured out that they would like to live somewhere like we were creating for working class black people, because they wanted the opportunity to live somewhere where they could own a home, pay their water, lights, gas bill for about $1,200 a month. And so we have plans to build communities where people can buy homes for about $100,000 and $140,000 a year. We don't have that in this city. And so we need public housing, workforce housing, affordable housing. Well, I don't care what they do with it after they put the workforce in. They want to, I can't buy none of it anyway. So, but that's what we need. That's what we propose as some of the solutions.
I will speak to Brooklyn Park. Brooklyn Park was created in the 1890s as a streetcar suburb by James Barton. And during that time, Louis Ginter was building his community at the same time. Brooklyn Park was built as a low-income community around the streetcar suburb, and that would allow the first original inhabitants of that community to move in. Once I-95 tore up Jackson Ward, a lot of the more affluent black families moved towards the outside because they could afford those homes. And a lot of those families are second and third generations are still there, struggling. A lot of people have said that Brooklyn Park will be the next Carytown or the next Scott's Addition. And every time they say that, I cringe. And I tell them it's never going to happen, never. Carytown is a community, and so is Brooklyn Park, and they are completely different. The black people in our community can't afford to pick up the need. So needless to say, they're not going anywhere. Since I've been with the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation, I recently started a nonprofit called Ascend RBA. ASCEND RBA Inc., and it stands for Advocating for Steadfast Collaborative Eradication of Neighborhood Displacement. I know it's a lot. And basically what we're doing is trying to tackle this gentrification in threefold fight. One being policy advocacy. And we're pushing at the state, Senate level to enact some laws. One being inclusionary zoning, which we want to make that a law of the land, which means that these developers who, while I don't like the word affordable housing, because these developers have learned the language of affordable housing, and they know how to use it to take advantage and get the benefits that we don't know or can't use. So we want to make community benefits agreements the law of the land, saying basically that if developers come into our community, you meet with the community and we lay out a joint vision of what we want our community to see, and we make that an agreement on paper that you won't price us out, and you will put in amenities and the green spaces that this community needs. Brooklyn Park does not have a grocery store. They're lacking green spaces, and even with the recent flight that we have now, white people within this community, we still don't have these services. Brooklyn Park still has crime, we have trash, we have graffiti that the city still looks at us and they look at our tax roll and they say, there's no money coming off of Brooklyn Park. So we don't concern that with them. So again, we're still dealing with those same issues. So we're trying to come with it and again, make it legal and make it the law of the land, so that if you come into our community and do this work, then we want to be right there with you to say this is what we want to see, this is how we want to go. So it's a lot to do, but we're in this fight.
So, one of the things that I learned is, and part of the issues I think with even using the term affordable housing is that there's like a spectrum, and it's based on the area median income. And for Richmond, the area median income includes the city of Richmond, Chesterfield, Henrico, Hanover. Like, it's a large area. And so for a family of four in Richmond, actually I think 100% of the area median income right now is around $82,000 a year. So in order to be considered affordable housing, you can be earning 80% of the AMI, and so 80% of 82,000 is still a lot of money, right? If you think about a person who is working 52 weeks a year, earning minimum wage, and where they fall on that spectrum, they're closer to the 10%, 15, maybe 20% of the area median income. Now, the other piece I want to add to that is when you look at the affordable housing sector, right? So who are the organizations providing affordable housing? The majority of them are serving folks who maybe as low as 60% of the area median income all the way through 120% of the area median income. There are a couple of exceptions that will, like Habitat for Humanity, that'll go lower, maybe around 50% or 47 or 48. Sometimes Better Housing Coalition will have rental properties, certainly for excluding seniors, but that'll go as low as 50%. But there's a significant gap between people at that 50% mark and below. Public housing, are y'all following me?
That's what your affordable housing conversation sounds like.
Yeah, but I think it's important to understand this, right? So that you can know when someone is saying affordable housing, we're still talking about people earning $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year, right? For public housing, typically that falls around 30% of their median income or below. So there's a significant gap. When we talk about workforce housing, when we talk about being affordable to people who are not making, who may not be college educated, who again are not making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year, it's a significant gap in who's serving that population. So I think one of the strategies is that we have to figure out how to close that gap and to be vigilant and intentional about closing that gap so that folks can actually have housing and home that is affordable. I think it includes preservation, but it also includes development as well. Gentrification is not just physical displacement, it's cultural displacement, right? So, hey, Mariah, I just Say hi. Sorry, y'all. That's my Churchill coming out. Okay. So cultural displacement, we, in the same way that we have to be vigilant about preserving and creating housing that is affordable for all of the people in our community, we have to do the same with culture. That means celebrating the stories of Jackson Ward. Like, I graduated from RPS, and it wasn't until I was working for VCU that I really learned about Jackson Ward. That's unacceptable, right? There's a story of Churchill, there's a story in Blackwell, and beyond murals, I mean, whether it is murals or festivals or statues, right? Like, we have to figure out, how do we establish a cultural identity and celebrate those things in communities so that when people start feeling deprived of their sense of belonging, like, do I belong here anymore? The stores that I used to go to, the store that I met my husband doesn't exist anymore, right? Like, is this still my neighborhood? We have to figure that out. And the third is that it's economic displacement. And so we have to find ways, I mean, similar to what Art was saying, we have to find ways to support development, encouraging Black developers, providing access to resources. So I think we need a three-pronged approach. There's physical displacement, there's cultural displacement, and there's economic displacement, all through gentrification. And we need to have strategies in all of those areas to help preserve our communities.
I totally agree. The one thing, well, there are a couple of things I think that economic equity, inequality, right, is that if we look at all of that data, economic inequality is perpetuated by corporations, right, along gender and race lines, right, time and time again, right? Until we can address that, until our business community can address that, we're not going to get very far into getting people into wealth building opportunities in ownership of land, which has been historically denied to brown and Black people in this country, right? So, equal pay. And that's going to take that's, when you look, I read something recently that had to do with the amount of wealth owned by, the amount of wealth owned by people that inherited it, right? And it's significant, right? So it's like, I don't even remember the statistic, but there was a I think a school in Chesterfield last year or the year before got in a whole lot of trouble for showing this little video, I think it was an animated thing, right? Of like, what was, yeah. Henrico, sorry. But it was basically showing like, it's like a foot race, right? And white people running from the beginning, right? And they're way ahead. And then like 1964, brown and Black people got to start running. And so, part of my job is to enforce the Fair Housing Act, right? And so there's part of that is like make sure people aren't being discriminated against and enforce that. The other part is to be affirmative. And so that's the part that like we are all, I think, in this room on the same page that where we are right now was intentionally designed by primarily dudes that look like me, right? We have to be as intentional undoing that as it was created. And so that means wealth opportunity. That means not being afraid of what's going to happen if some privilege disappears or goes away. For me personally, like being painfully cognizant of that at all times, until it becomes second nature, right? Hopefully. And then I think the other thing is being a good neighbor, right? I say this, people, I lecture and stuff, and people are always like, well, what can we do? And that, varies on the person, but all of us can be a good neighbor. And I don't know what that means, because I'm sure I haven't been a great neighbor at times, right? But I also know that the best neighbors I ever had lived in Brooklyn Park. I moved, my wife and I moved onto Garland Avenue in 2005, kind of diagonal across from the first black woman that moved onto Garland in the 50s. Her son and his family lived right across the street. It was a real community of neighbors, and as mommy across the street, her dementia got worse and worse. She would get out, and there were many times I'm running down the street after this 80-year-old woman in a bathrobe, like getting her back home and making sure she's safe, and like caring for your neighbors, regardless of class or race, is, I think, really critical, especially in today where we are super hyper-partisan and there's just a lot of angst. So that's the one thing I always tell people. It's just it's easy and free, right?
I think Brian brings up an interesting point about privilege, and so from our perspective as white guys, I think we have to approach this, differently. And I think there's two ways to go about coming up with solutions, right? There are top-down solutions, and then there are bottom-up solutions. And I think what I have learned is that as a white guy, I can use my privilege to hopefully fight for solutions from the top down that affirmatively advance the equity that Brian was talking about. One example is, in getting back to this whole discussion about what does affordable housing mean, well, in order to really reach the level of affordability where that need is, in Richmond at least, which Shekinah was alluding to, the 30 to 50% and lower, home ownership is really tough at that level. There are ways to do it. There are ways for shared equity models to reach that low, and there are innovations that we can advance. But really, rental is the name of the game at that point. But rental housing in the city is very hard to develop just in general in some cases, especially if you want to make it affordable. Doing rental multifamily housing is illegal because of zoning in wide swaths of the city. And so if we want to have discussions about creating housing that is affordable through whatever mechanisms are available to us at that deep level, we have to think about top-down solutions to change our land use and zoning regulations that were really put into place decades ago to cement the redlining and the exclusion that was happening in the first half of the 20th century when zoning really came into being. So there's ways, I hope, for people like Brian and myself to use our privilege in ways like that. I think the other side of that coin is taking our privilege and helping bottom-up solutions get fostered and created by just moving out of the way sometimes, or a lot of the times, and really allowing communities to come up with innovative solutions on their own, like Art was talking about, to creating a house that is, by its design and by its placement, can be super affordable and is something that, a community can buy into. And so I think those are the two ways, at least, white people like me can, begin to undo some of the things that gentrification is doing and move in a positive direction. But I'm still learning, so we'll see.
Don't pass the mic just yet. Tell the people a little bit about the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust, those who might not be aware of that.
Sure. So the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust is the second community land trust in the state of Virginia. The first one was in Charlottesville, the Thomas Jefferson Community Land Trust. There are hundreds of community land trusts across the country. Community land trusts are a unique model of home ownership where the nonprofit, the community land trust, the CLT, purchases in this case, a piece of vacant land. It will develop a house or have a house built on that land in one way or another. And then when it comes time to sell that house, the buyer purchases only the house itself and the land stays with the land trust. That reduces the price of the house. Again, we can also put in additional subsidy depending on what the market is saying and what affordability level we're trying to reach and who needs to be served, we can hit a certain price point. But by removing the land from the transaction and keeping it within the trust, which is controlled by community members and community stakeholders in perpetuity, that allows the home to remain perpetually affordable for generations, because when it comes time for that first homeowner to sell their home in 5 years, 10, 50, however long they might want to live there, the appreciation that accrues in that property, which can be a lot in areas like Churchill that are gentrifying and experiencing huge increases in property value, that appreciation is shared between the homeowner, so they get some return back, and the other parts of it, depending on the ratio that's set, the other parts of that appreciation stay with the home, stay inside the CLT to lower the sales price for the next buyer. So it's a way of securing below market rate housing prices for home ownership for a community for as long as the CLT is around, for in perpetuity. It's not a silver bullet by any means, but it's just a tool that we need to have in our toolbox to create wealth building opportunities. And I think the Maggie Walker CLT is really positioned as a stepping stone, hopefully, for folks to get into a house in a rapidly appreciating area in a neighborhood that they might have grown up in that have no other way to afford a home there because the housing prices are increasing rapidly, but it gets them a foot in the door, and it allows them to potentially buy their own home and their own piece of land outside of the CLT model at some point down the road, or they can stay in the CLT house for the rest of their life. We're happy either way, but it's a way to put land into community control and create perpetual affordability for generations.
Yeah, thank you.
So I got a news flash for you guys. Black people don't need white people to do anything for them in this city other than give them an opportunity to get to resources. We have enough human resources and intellectual capital to do pretty much what we want to do, okay? But we just need the opportunity, and we need someone to be intentional about giving us the opportunity. If we come to you and we ask you for your help, it's not because you're white. It's because you have some creative or intellectual capital that we need to further the plan. And if we need for you to use your white privilege, we'll give you the piece of paper and say, please use your white privilege and go in here and get this for us. Okay? I mean, it's really, that's what we do it to Ryan all the time. We say, Ryan, take your white privilege, go get us this. So that's what we do. And so, I'm going to just dedicate this last little piece to my sister, Lily A. Estes. When I woke up this morning about 3 o'clock, actually my friend Jake woke me up. He's in a band, he was coming back, he woke me up. He said he had some pizza, and I woke up, I said, you know what, Jake? I think Lily has finally drove me crazy. I said, did I actually walk across the state capitol carrying a cardboard coffin singing We Shall Overcome? And he said, yeah, you did. He said, yeah, you really did. I said, okay, I think I've done enough. I was in a dentist, there was an old black lady. She was talking about living in a Tepper Brother house. I don't know, this is probably old. Tepper Brothers was a renter And black people lived in his homes, and they were substandard and horrible homes. And she talked about how she would use newspaper to put between the walls to keep the air coming from in. And she talked about how every morning in the winter she would have to get a quart can to get oil to keep her house warm. And then she said public housing came. She said I had walls, they were concrete, but there was no air coming in them. She said for the first time in my life, I could turn the thermostat and get some heat. She said for me, public housing was the greatest thing that ever happened in my life. Y'all have heard us use all these words, have all these conversations: gentrification, racism, affordable housing, poverty, intentional bias. And I would strongly urge you guys not to wear any of our old stuff, because that's our old stuff. This is no longer a black and white world, okay? As much as we want to cling to it. I mean, the last time I used my pimp game, I was on the university, and I walked up to this sister. She was so beautiful, and I said, you know what? Us black people, we got to stick together. And she looked at me. She said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "We don't talk like that no more." She says, "I'm Mexican, Asian, and African." I said, "Oh, okay." You know, we are past the place where we can look at people by the color of their skin and say who they are anymore, you know. We have the ability, we have the intellectual, we have the resources. What I love about this city is I know that this is a city that does anything it wants to do. We always have. We can do it. We've always done anything we want to do, and whatever we're not doing is simply because we just don't want to do it, okay? That's just the reality of our city. We can build the next generation of public housing, not because people are poor, not because they are broken, not because their streets are dirty, not because they're violent, but simply because we want to do the next great thing.
Dave, can I take a couple questions from the audience? We got some time for that?
This is a historical question about, you all have done a good job of setting the racial historical issues around all of the problems, but I'm wondering if there are any historical references to bodies or groups of folks that have done collective economics or cooperative economics to address housing issues within the city, or maybe even nationally, that have maybe been buttressed by the other kind of redlining systemic issues, but if there are any kind of models that may be able to be repeated to address some issues that come from a more collective, cooperative economic base.
Well, you know, it's interesting because one of my complaints with the Office of Community Wealth Building is that they go all over the country finding models, and one of the greatest models for black economic development is right here in the city, and it's called Jackson Ward, okay? And we're very intentional about these large housing development efforts that require people to build 250 homes at a time, but black people have always built homes one at a time. And they've always helped each other build homes. And they build a home, and then they build a home, and they build a home, and they have a community. And so we really have to get back to where we give black people and black contractors and black developers the opportunities to build their own communities. If when you look at the work of Maggie Walker, you know, it started with small savings plans and cooperatives, and we're building that effort now with the Food Justice Corridor in the East End, and it's modeled after some work called Align Tennessee, where everybody comes together and is really intentional about solving a problem. And so that would be one. And then, of course, I think as African American people, you know, as controversial as it is, I think you have to look at some of the work that the Nation of Islam has done and is doing across the country as models of work. And then Duran can talk about some of the stuff that's being done on the food justice corridor side that ties into land and reparations around giving land back.
I'm gonna throw this in there. In terms of the food justice conversation, there's a book by Jessica Danhart called Collective Courage about African American Cooperative Economic Development. And then Richmond is in the index of the book, right? How about that? The Red Circle Cooperative in Richmond, Virginia, in the 60s, built a cooperative grocery store in Jackson Ward as a solution to the lack of ability to go to the grocer across the street, right? They pulled their money, put it together, and made healthy food available for the Black community in Jackson Ward. And I think it's just amazing that as we have these conversations around food access and food justice, in the context of, you know, redlining, displacement, you know, the non-neglected communities, and nobody has had a conversation about the historical precedent of the Red Circle Cooperative from 1960, right here in Jackson Ward. And I just want to put that in. Thoughts? Again, I'm trying to make sure that everyone has a chance to chime in. And I saw your hand up.
I'd like to say I've been a part of this gentrification issue since October last year. And I have moved everything from Hood, City of Richmond, Project Homes, whatever items that were given to me as far as resources to look into to see what I have done to take care of the issue. Twice a week I get 2 postcards with a picture of the house telling me that looks vacant, do I want to sell it? 3 times a week I get phone calls, robocalls, same time every day. Person wants to buy the house. I've gone down to City Hall, asked for information. The people in City Hall really can't refer me to anyone as far as resources to check into. The city's website still has White Jones's picture there for the mayor. I'm at a point where, by the grace of God and a representative from the property inspection office, the only thing that saved me at this point is bad weather. You know, so I'm up against either I get the repairs done that the city says I need to have fixed, which I've been told would not have been cited in the first place had it not been for some of the people that are trying to buy properties in the neighborhood. So, you know, when you're living, I work, don't make a fortune, I'm not middle class, I'm a widow. Do I sell my house and then try to live the rest of my years off what little I'm going to get? You know, I purchased a home in 1987 for $33,800. Jefferson interest loan, never refinanced it. I paid the mortgage off 2 years ago. To have it for my children after I pass on. What do you do?
Community. So that's a layer cake, and I thank you for sharing, ma'am, because I think that speaks to the title of today's conversation.
No, I'm Sam Talk.
Okay, this is Laura Lafayette. Laura is involved in a great many affordable housing efforts in the city. So y'all make sure y'all connect and make sure that before we leave, we can get your information. We can figure out what some strategies that folks can circle around you. Because I know what you're talking about, right? The house that I live in currently was under that same circumstances, like this close to being foreclosed, right? So if it wasn't for me and my fiance saying, okay, well, we're gonna step in and take over, you know, the mortgage, house would have been foreclosed on, bank would have got it, and then, you know, it would have been the next redone house on North Avenue, right? So it is a community response that's often necessary, you know, to keep people in place and keep homes within the family, keep homes within, you know, that context. But we know that the reality is a lot of the homes around the city that were built in the 50s, they need some rehab, right? Like I said, my house has oil heat, right? So from November to March, I'm $300 a month, right? And that's some hard decisions. Like, am I going to buy XYZ or am I going to pay this heat bill? And so something might be late, right? And I think a lot of families in the city experience the same thing. Their houses are not weatherproofed, you know, so the windows need to be redone, the roof might need to be redone, you know, there is no central AC or heat in the home. So, you know, we got to figure out strategies that we can help with just the everyday decisions that homeowners are having to make, right, in order to keep them in their home so that they can pay the taxes, you know, on it, or, you know, they can fight back on these developers that are trying to take the home away from them. Any other questions, thoughts, feedback? We've got 2 people here.
Hey, this is an ideological question. It's for this gentleman right here. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Right through your holding. Like, yeah. I'm just interested in the ideology. You had mentioned Battery Park and how, you know, a lot of the white people started moving back in, and they have one idea of how a neighborhood should be, but the black folk that have been there for a while have a different one. Can you explain the difference to me? It's really interesting.
Most of the communities that a lot of these white residents came from are 90% white, meaning that most of them have never lived around black people. So they have a concept of what they think community is from what they've grown up with, and when they come into our communities, it's a culture shock because they're not used to seeing the levels of denigration that a lot of these communities are being forced to deal with because we don't have the resources. I think the biggest issue in this city and the biggest impediment to this city is the education system. Plain and simple. And I'm an RPS graduate, but our school system is failing miserably. I worry about Northside and Brooklyn Park a lot because we're talking about homes that less than 10 years ago, a newly renovated house in Northside could probably run you 120, 150,000. Now we're looking at homes now that you won't get under 300. They're over 4, they're pushing for 5 now. And at one time, the only homes that cost that much were in Genrification Park. Now they're all over Northside. So I'm living in a home that cost me $120,000. But you just put a home next to me now that's $450,000. So what's gonna happen to me? Now, when we have these millennials moving in, and when they have children, and our elementary schools are very good, I will say that. The elementary schools and Richmond public schools are good. But when they get to the middle school level, that's when the flight takes. That's when they leave. So what's gonna happen when they decide to leave again? And we have these $300,000, $400,000 shells just sit there, that no one is going to be able to just pick them up and run into them and live in them like they are now. So our education system starts one. That's the main thing. Also, a lot of these programs that are out here, HUD, Better Housing Coalition, I mean, they're good, but they're not good enough. There are a lot of grassroots efforts in the city going on that a lot of us are involved in, and that's where you really have to look at. I've been studying programs in other cities. In Seattle, you know, that has an advocacy program that is really doing great things in affordable housing. So we're looking at other cities and seeing what they're doing that's being successful that we can implement here in the city. Because, I mean, these organizations have been here for years and people are still starving. So some changes have to come.
two things I'd like to add to the ideology part is that a lot of times when white folks come around black folk and look at the problems, the assumption is that there are problems because black people simply don't want to do anything about it, okay? When the reality of it is black people simply cannot afford in a lot of cases to do anything about it. So when you come into the room, as opposed to saying what you think needs to be done, maybe you could start having the conversation with people of color about what they have been trying to do and see how you can support that effort. Southern Garden Heights is the challenge is that was a black middle class community made up of largely professional teachers, and there was white flight and then there was black flight of the middle class. And so in most white communities, you have a professional class of people that most black communities now, particularly in the city, don't have. They just all are gone. I mean, if you want to build a house, you can find a carpenter, plumber, electrician, you're good. But if you're looking for a teacher, a businessman, an accountant, then you're going to start to have problems. And so some of it is about return of intellectual capital to black communities so they have the resources to be able to help figure out how to solve their problems. They know what they want to do. They just need the intellectual capital and the resources. And so, but those are some of just my observations and suggestions that I would make.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I just want to start off by saying thank you to the orchestrators and the participants of this event. Before coming here, I'm a freshman at VCU. I'm from Newport News, Virginia. Before coming here, I've had conversations for months about gentrification, and I've had extreme difficulty understanding what this actually is before tonight. So thank you guys for my question is, what does this look like from the standpoint of someone who's in a home, who's becoming a victim of this? Because I simply lack the experiential part of that, because I've never owned a home. I'm 18. But what does that look like? You know, like, how does that start? Does it start with the phone calls? And like, what does that mean? And why are they forced? What does that forcing look like?
So I'll just jump in and I'll pass it to them. The first thing that it looks like is, when someone purchases a home in a neighborhood, right, the value of that home, there's a website, there's an assessor's value to that home, right? So somebody comes in and purchases that home above the assessed value, right? That raises the value of the homes in that general area, right? So multiply that times not 1, not 2, but times 10, times 20, right? When those homes are starting to be purchased above the assessed value price, then everyone that was living in that neighborhood prior now has to pay higher taxes, right, on their home, right? And so what that does is it could be a slow shift, right? You know, maybe it's $100 extra a year, right? But in some cases, it's like from $200 to maybe $1,600 in taxes in a year, right? So that's a drastic shift. And so if you as a homeowner become delinquent on your taxes, right, then you are at threat of losing your home. Right? So once you become delinquent on your taxes, then the house becomes tax delinquent, then the house can be taken from you, and then now you are displaced, right? That's the homeowner side. From a renter's side, right? As a renter of a home inside of a community that's rapidly transitioning, your rent might be $650 one year, right? But as the neighborhood becomes a hotter commodity, that next year it might be $700. Next year after that might be $750. Then the person that owns the property that you're renting might sell said home, and then now says, okay, I'm not renting next year. I'm going to upgrade the entire house, and now I'm charging $1,050 for the house, right? So then that means that you as a renter are now displaced from the area in which you live. So, you know, it's a home thing. It's also about, you know, the development of commercial properties in the area. So, you know,
in Churchill, we're looking at what's happening with Market at 25th and a development around that area. We know that the property values are going to raise up because once a grocery store comes into a neighborhood and other commercial developments happen, that means that the taxes and the assessed value of those homes in the area are going to rise up as well. So these are like the market factors, and I'm going to stop there and let some of my other folks that maybe can allude to some more of the elements to this better than I can.
Sure. So yeah, just anecdotally, two things come to mind. Remember a couple years back, barefoot running was this thing? Like people were running barefoot. I was living on Garland, and I saw a white guy running down my street barefoot. And I knew at that moment that that neighborhood was gentrifying. Right? Like that was the tell, right? I was also, about a year after that, at work doing something, and I was like, sometimes I'll be like, have to get on Google Maps, and like I'll be looking at whatever, trying to find a property or whatever, and Google Maps like captures, you know, it's just a car. I actually was out, I got on Google Maps out in front of my house waving at the thing, but anyways, which for me was like, I've reached it, like, but I was like looking up in Churchill, and I, you know, like there were these three young white guys walking down the center of the street in a neighborhood where that was out of place, right? And I was like, that's what it looks like. But as a neighbor, right, that has kind of lived in gentrifying areas, I've seen it as people passing away, right, in older neighborhoods, because, you know, Brooklyn Park was, and still is, an older neighborhood, right? So I attended more funerals than I would have liked to of neighbors. I've seen it as job loss. And I've seen it as people moving to the counties for schools, right? So there's a lot of forces at play. So it's just a complicated thing of what it looks like. But if you see running barefoot.
Just really quickly, I'll add. So one of the favorite stories I talked about was my parents buying that house, right? For them, while this is a complex, nuanced issue, the value that their house has been increasing is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Right, so they say to me, Shekinah, basically, you're not gonna have to take care of us when it's time for us to retire, because we're gonna tap into the equity in our home, right? And that's one thing. To just a side note, we have seen income. We've been closing the gap in terms of income inequality, but it's the wealth gap that's the big thing. Like for Black folks, it's $17,000. For white folks, it's $271. And 2/3 of that is property ownership. And so being able to have financial resiliency, so that if I do lose my job or something happens, I can tap into some cash or some equity is important. So for my parents, who again bought this affordable home years and years and years ago, having that equity is building wealth for them because they're homeowners, right? If you are a senior on fixed income and you can't pay your taxes, you are in jeopardy of losing your home. For me and Demetrius, we don't own a home yet, we're renters. So for us, it looked like having 5 different addresses in 4 years because the rent kept going up and the amount we could afford in terms of square footage kept going down. It also meant, honestly, there were times in the process that we felt robbed of our dignity. So I'll give you an example. We were staying in a house and they decided, you know what, the property is going up. We need y'all to move out in the next 30 to 60 days because we want to sell the house, right? And like moving is expensive, so you gotta have enough for the deposit. You hoping that the house is in good shape, you can get your deposit back. Sometimes it doesn't happen. But so we're looking in other places and you have to set multiple appointments because people don't show up. We went to multiple places that literally had garbage in the house. We had folks say to us, this is right on that borderline, so if y'all, this is a good time to get into this house, because if you can rent from here, the other side, this is not the dangerous side of the neighborhood, right? And I'm thinking, like, this is where I'm from, what do you mean? Like, what are you saying? And I had to say to people, would you live here? Like, would you live here based on what you're showing? But we haven't talked about capitalism, and that's just the general laws of supply and demand and greed, and this basic human need that we all have for home and for shelter is attached to this like wealth building capitalism system. And so it means that you have experiences like that. And my husband was like, why don't we just move somewhere else? I was like, ain't nobody finna tell me that I can't stay in the neighborhood that I've grown up in and that I know and I love. But that's what it feels like.
So thank you for sharing that, Shekinah. I appreciate it. So Richmond versus everybody. I'd like to thank all of you all for coming out tonight. Give yourselves a round of applause for being here. And continue that round of applause for all my co-panelists. So from here, I was on Instagram and somebody was like, yeah, why should I come to this? I said, you ain't never been in nothing like I do it, I had to encourage them. I'm leaving you with some homework, all right? First off, I need you to Google home, housing opportunities made equal. I need you to Google the Maggie Walker Community Land Trust. I need you to Google the Richmond Food Justice Corridor. I need you to Google the Brooklyn Park Area Association and the Ascend.
The Historic Brooklyn Park Collective.
Historic Brooklyn Park Collective. And, Shekinah, should I say Virginia List? I need you to look up these organizations that are doing work to address these issues on a day-to-day basis. It's imperative for you as, community to plug into these organizations, find ways to support the work that they're doing, connect with them on an intrinsic level, right? It's not just about like a transaction. It's like these organizations need people power to push it forward. They need funding, they need ideas, they need ambassadors. So if you have time and energy and are passionate about this topic, you have been introduced to 5 organizers and organizations that are dedicated to addressing these issues that have been so eloquently discussed today. Lastly, make sure you follow all of the social media for Beautiful RVA, which is at everything Beautiful RVA, and Deron Shavers. I'm not gonna hold y'all up anymore. I know we're supposed to get out of here tonight. Shout out to Rashid Johnson and Monument and the Institute for Contemporary Art here at VCU for allowing us to have this amazing event here today. Thank you, David. And y'all make sure y'all take a lot of Instagram photos. Shout out, peace. See y'all later.